is a historian, a lecturer, and a publisher of a local newspaper in Vermont, correct? New Hampshire.
Yes. No, Vermont.
Yep. She has written 2 books about the hidden history of the Underground Railroad and abolitionists in New England. And so I'm going to let Michelle tell you a little more about that. I met her here in Claremont, New Hampshire. She was speaking at the Historical Society, and I just felt like I could have sat by her knee for a week to get all this information in. But it really piqued my interest about the way that that there are lessons to be learned from what happened during the Underground Railroad days and what could be coming our way now in 2025. So I'll be the one who's trying to connect those dots based on what you're telling us today. Michelle, what would you like us to know about you first?
I have been in the newspaper business for 40 plus years, right out of high school. And I've run the gamut of starting at the bottom as a typesetter, working my way into the newsroom. I've been at this weekly local newspaper in Bradford, Vermont for 25 years. And in 2022, had the opportunity to purchase it from my former employer. Basically, we're stewards of a newspaper that's been around for 160 years. So history is something that I love and always have. And I've been a writer all my life, and I started doing articles. And I had the opportunity to do one on an Underground Railroad safe house in Haverhill, New Hampshire, back in 1990s. And that began peeling the onion of this history that nobody really accepted at the time. And also it's hidden. So that's something we want to talk about today, is the fact that there's a lot of things that happened before the Civil War, a lot of Black heritage, a lot of Underground Railroad efforts in New England are just starting to surface, because the history was written by the people who wanted to make their version of it. And so we're learning a lot more as we go on. It's, and I try to focus on the people who did the work and why they did it, and also focus on real issues like racial injustice, prejudice, and erasing history. And so that's why I'm here talking to you, Kim.
So where do you find, if the history is hidden, where do you source the information that's still being uncovered? How does that happen?
So it's very similar to Civil War history, where someone cleans out great grandpa's attic and finds Civil War letters and finds out about the experience that a soldier had. It's very much like that. And people are still finding things about the Civil War. So the problem with the Underground Railroad efforts in New England and anywhere is that they had to be done discreetly for the safety of the people they were helping, fugitive enslaved people, and also for themselves. Each agent had to protect their own world, because it was not an acceptable thing to help and do something that was illegal by helping 1800s up to 1860s, you were doing something illegal if you were helping a fugitive. So yeah, so I source them. A lot of it's cross-referencing. You read a letter that was written in 1840 and it mentions 2 people that you've heard about somewhere else. So then you cross-reference and then you learn about that person, and find out more about them. It's not all written in black and white.
It's almost like a genealogy.
Yes, yes, yes. And I don't think I realized until I've been in this for so long, almost 30 years of researching, that everybody's connected. It's not isolated. And so I think that that's part of the thing, is that you're finding that all these people who were working individually in their homes, on their farms, men and women, they actually all knew each other because they all belonged to the same organizations. And you were really just doing your little part. So it's a pretty fascinating thing. It's not the cloak and dagger, pursuit of, bounty hunters pursuing enslaved people who were hiding out in New England. It's not that much like that. It's more someone is brought to your house at night and you're asked to help them. And you do it, even though it may risk what happens the next day at church or at your business. So these people were very courageous, and we're learning more about people who did this. So, and also the people who, the enslaved, who actually were the most courageous because they're the ones that risked their lives. Well, we focus on safe house just
Okay,
as a place that you stay
right.
before you're moved on to the next safe house, so to speak. Yes.
And so as you are, when I'm thinking about the time period, I'm thinking about women's role in society,
Hmm.
and the enslaved role and the men's role. And the men's history is what has been moved forward, their courage
Mm.
and their accomplishments or conquests. Have you uncovered any of the women's stories in those families? Were they aware of what was happening? Were they
Mm.
initiating or influencing or?
I think what you said is true, is that the men's role is the one that we've come to learn.
Mhm.
And the main thing about history in any situation is we're left with the impressions and perspectives of the person who wrote it down on paper. That doesn't mean that it is accurate reporting. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean that that's actually what happened. So that's where the hidden part comes in, is that you have people, you have women, you have blacks, uh, you have these stories that just were never told because the person who was recording all of this did not want that side of it. They wanted to paint a picture of, you know, the, the heroic white males,
Yeah,
which is really who wrote the histories in
right.
the 19th century. So there were lots of women who were involved, and there were lots of women who are nameless. And then there are all these wives of the Underground Railroad agents who I researched.
Mhm.
You have their wives. I do know some. I do know Nancy Safford in Springfield, Vermont. I know Nancy Carlton in Littleton, New Hampshire. I know Armenia White in Concord, New Hampshire. I know of them,
Mhm.
but that's only because they were given their credit in the 19th century. Otherwise, we would just know them as
Mhm.
Mrs. Carlton, and not know that there was any involvement. But of course there was. There
Right.
were some instances where it was secret. A man was doing the work and he wasn't telling anybody in his family. But for the most part, who's going to be cooking the bread and the stew to give to someone who's hiding out in the barn?
Mhm.
It's not going to be dad, it's going to be mom.
Right.
So, yeah. So, and it is pretty fascinating. And the more you dig into it, there are some really good books that have come out about women in the abolitionist movement. And that was a very risky thing for them to do because, like you said, looking back at this time frame, uh, if you stood up in your town and said, I'm against slavery and I think we should eliminate it, we think that everybody in the North would be like, yeah, and vote for that guy, let's make him a senator. No, that's not how it was. Because in the North, before the Civil War, it was really, let's not rock the boat. Don't change our country. Our country's fine. It's not our problem because, they're not enslaving us. We're not
Mhm.
doing it. So when you stood up, you were the radical. You were the one that they threw eggs at and that they tried to shut you up.
Mhm.
So if you were a man doing that, they would try to shut you up. And people and abolitionists who traveled around New England were not received very well. Sometimes they were, but most of the time they were not. They were mobs. There were people who were trying to get them to just, leave. We don't want you stirring the pot. And what I've learned in preparation for this meeting with you, Kim, was that even from the 1830s, women had a very important role in the abolitionist movement. And they started organizing with amongst themselves, and they created the corner, like the keystone of the strength of the abolitionist movement. Okay, so I'll just keep going on that. So you had women who weren't allowed to vote, weren't allowed to speak in public, could not get up on a stage in a town hall and do a public address at this time. But women could meet together, just women. They could have sewing circles. They could read abolitionist newspapers to each other. They could form their own anti-slavery societies. And they had a way of moving information and consistently through 1830s into the 1860s, keeping the ball rolling. And I believe it was William Lloyd Garrison Jr. who said that, I have to read it. He stated the fact that the abolitionists' women's historical invisibility, they were a great army of silent workers, unknown to fame, and yet without whom the generals were powerless. So all the men who were standing up and pushing for our country to stop the slavery institution, their anchor were the women who were continuing to spread the word. Because who's gonna go out in the markets? Who's gonna go to church? Who's gonna get together? Women. They're gonna get together, and what are they gonna talk about? The injustices of women like them who are not the same color, being beaten, sexually assaulted, horrendous treatment. And women, they related to that. They related to not having a voice. So they started to gather together, and they found that they had strength, and there were sisters. And they were sisters fighting for the oppressed sisters. So it's quite a whole other topic that I've never really opened the entire closet door on. And it's fascinating. It really is.
I see that today, that the women who are advocating for racial equity or for acceptance or for other social justice issues are women who have trauma
Mm-hmm.
or who know what it's like not to have a voice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. There were over 200 female anti-slavery societies in the North. That's a lot. Especially when only like 1% of Northerners were abolitionists. 1% out of the whole population were actually vocal, active abolitionists trying to change our Constitution and get rid of slavery. So to have 200 societies, just women, says a lot. And they were very active in building this structure of spreading the word, getting out there and canvassing and handing out pamphlets. It's almost like a religious fervor. And what they were doing was they were handing out pamphlets. They were they held anti-slavery fairs where they had craft fairs. And the whole idea was to raise money to help the fugitives and the cause. So you had this underlying foundation of women working silently to change the world that they knew. And that's a pretty amazing thing. And remember, they couldn't vote. They had no rights. And here they were. And we don't know this. This is all coming to light in the 21st century. How awful is that, really? Think about it. How awful is it to have something, well, everybody knows Susan B. Anthony, everybody knows who, the suffrage movement. Well, if you look into it, the suffrage movement had its foundations with the abolitionist movement. This is when women, the first time in the 1830s that women actually stood up and actually went out in the public and said, slavery's wrong. It's immoral. It's wrong all the way around. We need to get rid of it. And we're going to tell you, even though you're going to throw stuff at us.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, I mean, and this is, so it's really fascinating. It kind of gets off the trail of the hidden history, but not really.
Not really. You,
No,
yeah.
no.
And I love that after 40 years, it's an area that you've just started to dig into. That's going to take you another 40 years.
I always tell my family I'm stuck in the 19th century. I can't get out. I'm not a time traveler, but I can't get out.
Right.
Because even with Underground Railroad studies or abolitionist, the abolitionist movement, you're always coming across new things because new things are becoming available. Um, I spent a few about a month researching Springfield, Vermont. Someone had emailed me and said, hey, I have an ancestor who I think helped fugitives, on the Underground Railroad. Where did they live and where did they work out of? And I took that challenge on. I researched maps and I researched articles. I found stuff that I hadn't seen in 30 years. And I found articles that said Springfield, Vermont, they assist the family of fugitives. I mean, I found a newspaper article from the 1800s. And then I slowly figure out what building that was used and who the person was. This was all new information. And it was like I solved a mystery. Every little bit of it's a mystery. Each
Right.
each each task is a mystery to solve, just like these sister societies, just like this female abolitionist movement. That's a whole new thing. So yes, I'm always finding something new.
I was speaking to a ladies group earlier this week, and they were talking about getting off of social media because, TikTok is potentially getting shut down, which is where a lot of women coalesced around in
Yes.
2020. But but they were talking about we'll just have to go old school. We can still have Bible studies and we can still have sewing circles and we can
Right,
still
right.
have book clubs and um, yeah, because when women gather, magic happens.
Yes. And they talk and
Mhm.
they commiserate
Mhm.
and they support each other. Um, and that's what was happening then.
Mhm.
Nothing's changed. It's just, this is a reality. Women talk more and we have, and we share more and we support more. And
Mhm.
I think that is why in the 1800s, the women were already doing this, the quilting, a quilting bee, or they were already getting together to do things. But then they took on a cause that was greater than them. And at that time, it empowered them. And these books that I've been reading talk about the fact that this gave them a voice and gave them empowerment that, what, I can make a difference, even though I'm just supposed to, bear the children and make the suppers and keep the house. At
Right.
that time frame, these women became, this foundation. And the two books I do want to point out. Um, one of them is by Julie Roy Jeffrey, and it's called The Great Silent Army of Abolitionists. So,
Yes. Yeah.
which I can send you a picture. And then the other one is by Beth Salerno, and it's called Sister Societies.
Yes.
And these two really focus on things that I'm talking about now, is that I'm learning because they are they cover the history of female abolitionists. And not every abolitionist was helping fugitives
Mhm.
to get to Canada, to get to freedom. But they were pushing political, for change politically.
Right.
So, but it is all fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. And so for those from 1830 to 1860, did it then roll over into other social issue causes?
The women kind of kept everything going. The men with the abolitionist movement halfway through, like 1840s, 1850s, is when they all started arguing the men amongst themselves. And should we let women in? And should we let this happen? The women were just keeping going and going. It's still wrong. We still are against it. We're still going to tell everybody it's wrong. So they were the ones that kept things going. And then once the Civil War happened, and once President Abraham Lincoln, the 13th Amendment, and they abolished slavery, then it was like, okay, they got their freedom. Let's get some freedom of our own. We've worked and we know how to do this now. So the suffrage movement would be the next thing. And that would take a long time because it wasn't until what, 1910?
Yeah.
Prejudice, it's all, racial injustice. It all has to do with people thinking that they need, you have to think my way and look like me. And, that it takes so long for people to be accepted for
Right.
who they are. And that's what this is all about. This is why blacks have fought, anybody of color have fought to be treated equally.
Mhm.
Um,
I heard
so,
a definition of racism. Actually, I think it was Dr. Nikki Lanier this week who said racism is the fundamental belief that Black and brown people are not fully human,
mm,
and the systems and policies and that are built to further that belief.
mhm,
Further
mhm,
that belief. And I thought, if you could just say to oblivious white women, our audience,
mhm,
do you believe that Black people are fully human? That should stop somebody in their tracks to go, why wouldn't I think that? And then,
right,
oh,
right.
wait, it has an opportunity to uncover some of the biases that we have generationally brought into our bodies that we may
Yes.
not even be conscious of.
You can be very sheltered in your little white world because you don't have any exposure to anybody of color. I had to understand what slavery really was and what people who had slaves, what they really thought of them. And that's when I learned about how they seriously, even the most intelligent people in the 19th century and before that, from the start of our country, how they seriously did not think that these were people. And it was like, no, they're not. They're like animals. And it's like, no, they're not. How can you say that? And so I spent a lot of time either reading slave narratives so that I could get a picture of, okay, this is really awful. Not just this, Sunday school childish view of things. That this is, read the accounts and read what they did to women, read what they did to men, and how awful that was, but also read the other side of it. Why do you do that? Why do you think you're okay to do that? And not judge them, because at that time, that's how they thought.
Right.
They thought that people who had disabilities were cursed. That it's taken so long for us to evolve as intelligent beings. It really does. And, I've done a lot of work on other subjects, but it all falls into racial injustice and prejudice. Um, Vermont, like all the other states, the history of poorhouses and institutions for people who had mental, had developmental disabilities, or they were, they were considered that they should keep them away and that they should try to not let them procreate. So where did eugenics come from? Where did the sterilization movement come from? This stuff was not from some diabolical scientist. It was from professors and doctors and intelligent people in the late 1800s and the early 1900s saying, we have to stop. We have to make our race all smart, intelligent, and white.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so even though we had eliminated slavery, we still had prejudice. You still had Blacks who were suffering lynchings and prejudice all the way up through, obviously, into the 60s, 1960s. We're really slow, really slow. We just don't evolve fast enough. But I learned in that history of profiling how states, how why eugenics was a big thing in the 30s, because that was a way of culling out the bad genes and the bad races.
Mhm.
It's disgusting. And it's very hard to learn about, but I learned it and
Right.
I studied it. And how Vermont in particular, but all the states were doing it. Let's get rid of any, Native Americans, any French Canadians, any Blacks. Let's get rid of them. How do you do that? Well, you put them in an institution when they're children and keep them there all their lives. And that way they can't, you know, reproduce.
They survive it. Yeah.
It's scary. And it was what was done. And now everybody gets all upset when they hear someone was, you know, in the eugenics movement. Well, everybody up until Hitler's the one that borrowed the philosophy.
Right.
Up until the 1940s, it was all acceptable and it was the most acceptable thing.
Mhm.
So it's really scary because the evolution of any of us is about, I'm the one that's better than you because I'm white. I'm this Anglo-Saxon. It's all prejudice because you're not the same as me and I need to be in charge.
And with that kind of history and that kind of power and that kind of precedent behind it, is that what makes people with my color skin, women particularly, far more inclined to, it doesn't affect me, so I don't have a dog in this fight. We're
Right,
one of the good ones, whatever that means,
right.
rather than being one of that 1% who stood up and said, not in my lifetime, not on my watch.
I think that you're correct. I think it's a very white, it's a very Caucasian kind of thing,
Mhm.
right? Europeans came to the New World and they had to eliminate the people of color here. Why? Because they were different, because their culture was different, their religion was different, they looked different, they spoke different. Well, that happened. I mean, all the I've done a lot of research over the years, like ancient Egypt, or, even history in the Bible. What did you do when you went into a foreign country? You went in, you conquered, you killed, or you enslaved.
Mhm.
And what did you do? If you kept people alive, you eliminated their religion, their culture, their language.
Right.
It was done in the Bible. It was done in all the ancient, Rome, all the ancient civilizations, the Egyptians and the Romans, and this is what you did. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that that's why we still have this ingrained in us. We come here, or we bring people from Africa and say, well, they're not human. So that
Mhm.
justifies me treating them like, you know.
Or in times of war. And I think
Mhm.
about Vietnam, and my children's father was a Vietnam vet. And
Mm,
and the dehumanization and the
mhm.
depersonalization that continued in his language throughout his life,
Wow. Wow.
that made it okay.
When I read about the men and women who canvassed New England in the 1840s and 50s, and they lectured town to town to town, what they were on a mission field.
Mhm.
They were on a mission field to educate these Northerners who were extremely narrow-minded and had no idea even how bad slavery was. So when Frederick Douglass would get up and say, okay, this is what happened to me. I was an enslaved person, and you want to know how bad it is? Yeah, it's really bad. That's because New England, you never saw it. You didn't see it. And so it made you complacent, and then it made you not your problem. And that's just, it's hard to imagine that half the country in the 1800s agreed that slavery was okay. It's really hard to imagine that.
Imagine that half the country today would agree that.
Yeah,
Closer, I think, than many of us want to acknowledge that.
very true, very true. Let's keep these people out. Let's not let brown people in. Let's not let Black people do this. It's so ignorant. It's disgusting. When I started out with the subject of slavery and trying to get the point across, and then the layer of the Underground Railroad agents who were risking themselves and their lives and, their reputations, not their lives, is that it slowly evolved. The subject changed as I went along, because for a while there, I would go and do a talk, and people would come up to me afterwards, and they would relate people helping, freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad, would relate that to refugees who were trying to come into our country at the time, like in the, early 1990s or late 1990s. And then it was about prejudice, and all of a sudden things got ramped up, and we had we just had such a terrible time, 2016, 2018, we're starting, and then all of a sudden my sharing of history became almost like these, platforms of racial injustice or explaining the roots of prejudice. How did we get like this? My focus has evolved, it's changed, and it's kind of like, let's learn from history. Let's go back and let's look how bad that was and apply it to today. And before the Civil War, the Northerners were really complacent and really didn't care. Most of them were like, yeah, whatever. I don't have to watch them beat somebody because I live in Vermont and that's happening in Georgia or Virginia. And they didn't have the news. They didn't have images.
There was no recording.
No. And there was no sound, there was no visual, the newspapers, the media is what they got their information from, or lecturers. Prejudice has reared its ugly head again. Everybody forgets that we're all immigrants. Every single one of us, except for the Native Americans, are immigrants on these soils. This is not an Anglo-Saxon, this is not a European soil. This started out with just Native Americans, and everybody came here. So everybody from Europe, everybody came here. That makes you an immigrant. And we all talked funny. Everybody that came here, all the different, you're Irish and you're Germans and you're Italians, and everybody came here. So to stand there and say, well, these immigrants shouldn't be allowed in. It's like, well, how did your family get here? Mine came through Ellis Island. Mine came over on ships. Where did yours come from? Did you just sprout? Did you sprout out of the woods?
But the conquerors are the ones then who write the history. Cowboys and Indians, okay?
Of course, yes.
But white hats and black hats, the good guys and the bad guys.
Yeah.
And at what point are we ever able to trust history? I remember when I learned about Juneteenth, and I, along with some celebrities, were saying, how come I never heard about that? I have a master's degree. I never heard about that part of history. Why
Right,
didn't we know these things? And then more and more began to be revealed.
right.
And now, of course, they want to shut down Black history because they don't want those stories of the truth of our past so we
Mm-hmm,
can learn from them and grow into them and beyond
mm-hmm.
them. Which you started this in New England and found out that they didn't record most of how many people had slaves, were slaveholders
Right,
in the
right,
books. You had to find that through back channels.
exactly. And it's for a person who's been in the newspaper business for my entire life, um, proper media is to report what is happening without bias and to stay true to what people are saying and make sure you're accurate and you're recording it, you're reporting it. It's not your view, it's not your viewpoint. It's I'm a witness and I'm recording all of this and it goes into the paper and this is the correct way to do it. So for me, when I learn that, this all these histories I've been reading for years has eliminated things, um, conscious omission. Let's just erase things. Let's erase that New Hampshire had any blacks living in it ever. That was actually the case from like the late 1800s up until the mid 1990s, is that no, New Hampshire was known as the lily white state. We never had any blacks here. We had no heritage until one person started digging in church records. Valerie Cunningham, a Portsmouth historian, she found enslaved people's names in church records in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And she blew the lid off of, wait a second, there was slavery here, there was slave trade, there were ships bringing slaves, there were auctions for slaves in Portsmouth. There were slaves in the census records. But guess what? If you don't look and you don't put it on chapter 1 in your history, town history, nobody's going to find it until they start digging. And so that's the hidden history, is like you said, we talked about earlier. It depends on who's doing the writing. So if you decided, like I tell people in my talks all the time, how many town histories were written after the Civil War in the late 1880s, 90s? You go through New England's town histories and you look at the copyright. And what you're going to find is that the person doing the writing wanted to tell a story the way they wanted it to come out. So I'm not going to talk, I'm only going to talk about Civil War heroes. I'm not going to tell you that we had slave owners in our town. I'm not going to tell you that we had blacks here. If I do tell you, it's going to be, oh, that's a cute little story I can put on, in this chapter. So they don't give them serious recognition.
Right.
So that history is they take that and they keep quoting it all the way through till now. And that's not the right history. How can you not recognize that there was over 650 slaves in New Hampshire in the 1600s? We didn't know this. We didn't know it until the digging was done. And that's what historians today have an awful lot of crap to scrape down. It's almost like refinishing a dresser. It's like it's been painted bright orange and then you scrape that down and then it's this ugly blue and then you scrape that down and then you find the actual wood. And then you realize, oh wow, that's walnut. That's beautiful. That's the original. So the history is the same way. You've got to scrape down until you get to something that is from that time. And maybe it's a newspaper article. And maybe it's a letter. I'm just going to grab this. I came across a letter. I just found this year. It's a letter that was written in 1840. It's got the abolitionist man, am I not a man?
Mhm.
That artwork? That letter was written by a woman in New Ipswich, New Hampshire in 1840. And she's writing a woman in Boston and saying, we're going to have this anti-slavery fair, and we want to sell these booklets, but we can't print them here. I'm sending them to you. Will you print them for me? I mean, I came across a letter that tells you what this woman is doing with other women in her town,
Mhm.
Little New Ipswich.
Right.
And she's teaming up, and she knows and is connected to a woman a female abolitionist in Boston. So that is the kind of history you want to lean on. Letters, journals, hopefully maybe something out of newspapers. They had agendas. Nowadays, you can't do that. Nowadays, we're very careful. We're objective, and you can't throw your opinion in things, because you're supposed to be a news outlet, not an instrument.
Yeah.
So anyway, so basically that's the kind of thing you kind of focus on, is what's your source?
Right. Right.
And if you cross-reference, and this person in one town says, I know that, I'm just pulling names out of my head. I know that Moses Sawyer in North Weir, New Hampshire, helped fugitives. And then then you find another instance written somewhere that says, yes, I know that I took this person to Moses Sawyer in North Weir. And you just kind of like collaborate and go, oh, okay, all right, so let's put him down. Yep, because if you just go by town histories, if you go by who wrote the histories in the 1800s, you're not going to find out about that. They don't want people to know that freedom seekers were going up through the North. They just want to say, we're the good guys, and
Mhm.
you're not like me.
Right. But even those good guys were only 1% of the population and were willing to be active. If women today wanted to create networks of safety across the country,
Mm-hmm.
people with a marginalized voice, whether that's women who've had the rights removed, or whether that's Black and brown people, or whatever it is, what are there any lessons that we can pull from all of the research that you've done that say these are things that could work, other than saying, go back to church and sewing circles, because church is not what it once was either?
No, of course not. No, that's true. I was connecting dots with people who were all in the abolitionist movement. So if people today are attending lectures and attending conventions, of the same, of a specific cause, and they make connections there, it's all networking. It's like people who come to my talks, like you, then you reach out to me afterwards and you say, hey, let's have a conversation about this. And why don't you come on to my podcast? So it's really just, they were networking, but didn't realize that's what they were doing back then. And that's really all this was. You find that they were all connected because they're either like back then you had your church affiliation, or you were all part of anti-slavery societies. So if there are groups that are for specific causes today, that's where you do your networking. And then everybody leaves their conventions, and then they go home and they start spreading the word. And then you kind of pass along the information, however you do it, email, social media. So it's kind of the way they did it, letter writing or boycotting things. Um, in the 1800s, it was pretty limited on what they could do, but look what they did.
Right.
They would get out and stand on the street corner and hand out tracts to people and say, well, the same thing can be done now. Get the posters up all over the place. Invite somebody to come and lecture in your town about a specific subject.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there are, um, I think you can learn from that. You have the same thing happening. Yeah, even if you go through the Bible and you see that there was prejudice there, and there was, you can't talk to that person because they're a Samaritan and you're Jewish, that kind of thing. This is all just part of our human nature that I don't think God did not intend us to be this way. I don't think.
Mhm.
I don't think he did. It's just that we're all very small-minded and we just don't get it. So I don't know. I don't know. I just think that you just keep seeing the same thing over and over again. And it's really, every person is a valuable person.
Mhm.
And they have it, it doesn't matter what their background is, what they're dealing with, that you need to value that person and show love. And it's really all it's about. And the people that I research and I highlight in my books and in my talks, they showed love and they showed support, and they put themselves out there.
Mhm.
Well, we should all do that. Make our little bubble a little bit better, and maybe there'll be more of it and the light just gets brighter.
The organism of the human condition is to basically seek pleasure and avoid pain.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And and what happens when you begin to delve into lived experience of other nationalities or other people groups is that you witness a different kind of pain. And
Mm,
sometimes that takes away my pleasure. That's too much, and I have to look away. And
right.
sometimes, because if I really step into that pain with them, it's like somebody who's grieving, I'm going to feel some things that are going to be
Yes.
uncomfortable,
Right, right,
and life changing.
right.
And so in this season, in this season 2 of One Voice Evolving, resilience is the thread that we're pulling through.
Mm,
So it's not just the resilience of history, but how do we be resilient for the next 4 years and beyond?
right,
And
right.
and how do we, even if the action is resistance, how do we take action, not just give it lip service?
I always push that you learn from history. I know that, we can say, well, that's just basic human nature, but we should be beyond this at this point. We really should have evolved to the point where we understand that, um, that everybody's different. And look, this whole resurgence of, genealogy and DNA testing and finding out, well, why can't that like that wave flow, crash over into how you think? So if you do a DNA test, or you do your genealogy and you find out that your ancestors came from, uh, Germany or Hungary or Italy, why can't you take that knowledge and accept people who are different from you, because that's where you came from?
Right.
Our country is really, really just kind of focused on white is the way of our country, and that's a real American, and that's not true. That's not true at all.
It wasn't then and it's not now.
It's not. It's not. And we, we're here, the land of the free, and we're here to, you have the Statue of Liberty, who was welcoming thousands and thousands of immigrants from Europe and all over the world. And all of a sudden, in 2025, we want to say you're not allowed here anymore. It just doesn't work. If we're the land of opportunity, we always should have been for everybody, not just for a select race.
Give us where people can reach out to you, where they can find you, if they want you to be a speaker, if they want more information, where your books are, all of that.
Have 4 books, and I do focus on the Civil War, and soldiers' experiences. I'm not one that's into battles. I'm more into, a soldier's experience, and focus on Vermont and New Hampshire. My books are published through Arcadia History Press, and you can just Google my name, and it's all they're all available online, all, all the websites and all the, the big name things. And I'm on Facebook, and I also, the newspaper that we own is the Journal Opinion in Bradford, Vermont. We have a website, www.jonews.com. And we're all local news. In the day and age of digital media and social media, we are still standing as a broadsheet print newspaper, and we will continue as long as we can. And we only cover local news. We don't have anything national. Everything is what's happening in our region in the Upper Valley of Vermont, New Hampshire. So people can reach out to me through, through Facebook or through the newspaper. And I'm really pleased that you invited me, Kim, to, share about new history and the history that that I go around and present, because I think it's important for us for everyone to learn and dig.
We are history in the making, and so may we make a better future than has been hidden in the past.
Exactly.